My name is Ariel Boone, and I'm working with Amazon Watch. We're really excited to have you on the call today to feature the voices of many supporters of Stephen Donziger as he remains on house arrest for going into his 9th month now. The speakers that we have today, we're going to hear from Jody Williams, Nobel winner. We're going to hear from Stephen Donziger. We're going to hear from Alec Baldwin, Roger Waters, Simon Taylor, Paul Paz-Emino from Amazon Watch, and Simon Taylor is from Global Witness, as well as Ginger Cassidy from Rainforest Action Network. We're going to give everybody a chance to ask questions because I know there's been a lot of questions and a lot of excitement and interest in Stephen's case, and the questions are going to come at the end. So you're welcome to put questions in chat privately to me if you're from the media, so specifically questions from journalists. And so again, my name is Ariel Boone, so you can put questions privately in chat. And if you are not using the web interface or you're using the phone interface, we'll also open for phone questions at the end. So, so that will happen after the web questions if you're not able to view the web interface. So I'm going to start by introducing Paul Paz-Emino, the Associate Director of Amazon Watch.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being on this call. We're here today not only because this concerns what is probably the most important corporate accountability case in history and the largest oil-related disaster in history, but also because Stephen Donziger is the only lawyer in U.S. history who's been ever detained pre-trial on a contempt charge, and this is going into his 9th month. So it's a very important issue, yet it has not caught the attention of the mainstream media, and that's part of the reason that we're having this call today. And we're also very excited that the Nobel Laureates have joined this call. And I want to introduce Jody Williams to speak next specifically about that. And Jody received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997 for her work as a founding coordinator of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which shared the Peace Prize with her that year. And since January of 2006, she has chaired the Nobel Women's Initiative, which she took the lead in establishing along with her sister Nobel Shirin Adabi of Iran. The initiative uses the prestige of the Nobel Peace Prize and the influence and access of the women Nobel laureates themselves to support and amplify the voices of women around the world working for sustainable peace with justice and equality. In 2012, she helped found the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which seeks to stop fully autonomous weapon systems that on their own could target and kill human beings. So thank you for being here, Jody, and I'd like to turn it over to you. And if you're still on,
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Cool. I'm pleased to be able to be here representing the Nobels who have signed this statement in support of Stephen and the Ecuadorian communities that he has been defending ferociously in a positive way for decades. It's not shocking to me that laureates from every discipline have signed this statement of support because it's a very activist community, to be quite honest. Whether they're from medicine or physics or chemistry or literature, they've all signed because they believe in the rule of law, they believe in justice, they believe that the people of Ecuador deserve the judgment be carried out. The $9.5 billion in suit against Chevron should be paid. I will not read the entire statement. First of all, because I don't read well, and second of all, because it would be taxing for all of us. So I'm sure you have it, so you can read it. I'll just pick a couple of germane points that really bothered all of us and helped us decide to do this on behalf of Stephen, who, by the way, I met way back in 1984, I think. Had to be then, when I was working in Nicaragua and he was a journalist there. Obviously, for everybody right now, the issue of coronavirus is capturing everybody's emotion and attention. At the same time, many of us feel that the virus pandemic is showing how important it is to take care of the environment. If nothing else, the pandemic demonstrates that globalization is real and it affects us all in ways we cannot predict. So we commend the defenders of the environment who in recent years have had the most attacks on them for defending the environment in various ways. And it is because they are fighting massive corporate and governmental interests who wish to see big industry do whatever it wants and pay the governments, and I won't curse, and who cares about the little people? So I'm going to just read a couple of paragraphs because these were the things that really agitated me personally. You've already heard and probably know that Mr. Donziger has been defending the people of Ecuador forever. I would imagine it seems like even more forever these days, Stephen. And through his work and others, as I said before, Chevron was judged to owe the Ecuadorian communities that are polluted by them $9.5 million. Rather than accept that judgment, Chevron, took its money and ran. And not just leaving it at that, they have decided that they must vilify Stephen Donziger. They want to use all of the tactics that they have been using with their judicial ally, U.S. District Judge Louis A. Kaplan. They want to use all of the PR firms, all of the billions of dollars that they have spent on harassing Stephen Donziger, to show environmentalists, to show activists all over the world that you cannot go up against corporations, you cannot defend what you believe to be true and right. And those of us who have signed this statement do not accept that. We do what we believe to be right for the greater good, not for the good of a corporation. One of my favorite bits here is when I looked into Chevron's website, and I found one of the values that Chevron espoused in what is called Chevron's way, which must be Chevron's way of acting in the world, which is a lie, but we're used to lies in this country these days. Our company's foundation is built on our values, which distinguish us and guide our action to deliver results. We conduct our business in a socially and environmentally responsible way, respecting the law and universal human rights to benefit the communities where we work. It's hard to put that together with the fact that, wait a minute, I gotta find it here. 17 million gallons of crude oil were poured into the Amazon, 16 billions of toxic wastewater that are causing untold illnesses and destruction of the environment of the 30,000 Ecuadorians who food them. They need to be challenged, and what Stephen Donziger is doing is challenging the lie of Chevron's way. And that is why we are so willing and happy to, lend our support. I will read a couple more paragraphs and then I will be quiet. Environmental activism in many countries results in murder. Chevron's strategy is death by 1,000 cuts through the manipulation of a legal system it has managed to stack in its favor. Its goal is to intimidate and disempower the victims of its pollution and a lawyer who has worked for decades on their behalf. That is why we have issued this statement, and we are calling on everybody fighting to save this planet to join us in raising awareness and support the Ecuadorian plaintiffs and their attorney, Stephen Donziger, and demand justice from the U.S. Department of Justice and members of the U.S. Congress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jody. We're going to hear from Stephen Donziger next. Stephen, are you ready?
Yes. Thank you so much, Jody. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to read from a statement quickly that I wrote out, so if you'll bear with me. First, I want to express my deep, deep gratitude to Jody and the other laureates who have taken the time to learn about the case and to support me and my family. I also want to thank Roger Waters and Alec Baldwin and Paul Poss at Amazon Watch and the other speakers, including Bill and Lynn Twist of Pachamama, and my various law colleagues, including Aaron Page, Rick Friedman, Andy Frisch, Charles Nesson from Harvard Law School, Marty Garbus, Jason Adkins, and others, as well as Karen Hinton, Simon Taylor of Global Witness, and so many others around the world who have stood by me, and the affected Ecuadorian communities during this challenging time. And of course, most of all, my family, which includes my wife and my 13-year-old son, Matthew. This issue concerns both my personal freedom, but also the world's largest oil-related contamination done deliberately by Texaco from 1964 to 1992 in one of the most delicate ecosystems on the planet. This contamination continues to this day, decimating indigenous peoples and local communities and causing an untold number of deaths and health problems from cancer and other oil-related illnesses. I believe my historically unprecedented pretrial detention for a lawyer, now in its 255th day, 255 days, is intimately connected to my effective and successful advocacy for these communities. I know that I will never be able to express how much this support means to me during this long period of house arrest, a house arrest that, in my view, has no legitimate justification. The support has been essential to keeping me healthy so I can continue to advocate for my freedom and also for the communities in Ecuador. Some quick points to understand the context of this unusual situation. First, I believe this situation is profoundly unfair, not just to me, but also constitutes a major threat to free speech, to advocates everywhere in our society. As Paul mentioned, I am the only lawyer in US history, as far as we can tell, who's ever been detained pre-trial on a contempt charge. The longest sentence for a lawyer convicted of criminal contempt in New York is 90 days of home confinement. I'm almost at 3 times that amount, and I have not even had a trial yet. This appears to be part of a new corporate playbook used to undermine successful corporate accountability and human rights advocacy by using the law as a weapon to attack the vulnerable, rather than as a shield to protect the vulnerable from abuse by the powerful. Second, the way this is happening is deeply disturbing. In a normal criminal case in our federal system in the United States, a person is charged by a grand jury comprised of citizens and then prosecuted by professional lawyers in the US Attorney's Office who are obligated to adhere to high ethical standards. In this case, none of this has happened. Instead, a single judge charged me, handpicked a longtime colleague to preside over my criminal contempt case, and also hand-selected a private law firm that amazingly has Chevron as a private client to prosecute me after the professional US Attorney's Office refused the case. The private prosecutor, a law firm called Seward and Kissel, only disclosed 2 weeks ago that Chevron is a client after denying it for the 8+ months I've been in home detention. And make no mistake about it, the judge in this, who's behind all of this, Lewis Kaplan, is running my prosecution. For all practical purposes, he is acting as the grand jury, the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury in the same case. Again, as far as we can tell, this has never before happened in our judicial system. In my opinion, this is an abuse of power and a violation of the rule of law. And I believe my home detention, my unusually long home detention, is a direct result of these factors. I also believe Chevron itself is exercising enormous influence with the lawyers at Seward and Kissel to push this extraordinarily rare prosecution and unprecedented pretrial detention. And with the pandemic closing down most of the business in our courts, if nothing happens to free me, my house arrest could realistically last for many more months or even a year or more before I get a trial. Third, I want to be clear in saying that it is our position that the actual criminal contempt charges filed by Judge Kaplan should never have been brought. I want to be clear that I've done nothing criminal. It is my view that the case is happening largely due to personal spite from a court whose problematic decisions in favor of Chevron I have challenged for many years. I'm not saying I'm right and he's wrong, okay? But what I am saying is this is happening in the ordinary course of a civil litigation dispute. 3 of the charges, just so you understand the justification for me being here, 3 of Judge Kaplan's contempt charges concern major constitutional violations by Chevron or the court that I had put under appeal at the time Judge Kaplan charged me criminally, including an order that I turn over my computer, cell phone, and indeed most of my confidential case information to Chevron. The other 3 contempt charges he filed concern orders by him that I had already complied with to Chevron's satisfaction concerning a turnover of my legal fees in the civil RICO case. Yet Judge Kaplan filed the criminal contempt charges anyway, in my opinion, for no valid reason and to vindicate no valid interest. No lawyer on our team, nor any of the many fine lawyers with whom we have consulted around the country, ever has heard of a judge charging a lawyer with criminal contempt based on orders that were pending appeal at the time the charges were filed, or after the lawyer had already complied with orders in a civil case. Now, given what I believe to be the weakness of the contempt charges and the strength of the defense, the pretrial detention by this private law firm seems highly inappropriate. It feels to me like punishment without a crime. It clearly, in my opinion, is designed to break my will and crush my spirit. It also appears to be the result, based on the facts we recently discovered, of some degree of prosecutorial misconduct by the private law firm, given its failure to disclose what appears to be a flagrant conflict of interest involving its financial ties to Chevron and Chevron-related entities that it represents. We are now, as a result of these conflicts of interest and other reasons, seeking dismissal of the case with prejudice. And if that were to be granted, I would be freed from house arrest and the case would be over, and it should be over. We are also insisting that the trial and appellate judges in this district take seriously what appears to be an abuse of power by a private law firm working closely with Chevron, rather than acting as a disinterested prosecutor as required by law and Department of Justice guidance. The justification for house arrest, I'm almost finished, and my apologies for the length of this, it'll be about 1 more minute. The justification for house arrest advanced by the private law firm prosecuting me is that I am a risk of flight. They say that if I was not in house arrest with an electronic monitoring bracelet, that I would flee to Ecuador. Please think about that for a second. They believe I would just run away from a lifetime of work on this litigation, abandon my wife, abandon my son. And I don't even have a passport because that was confiscated. They believe this even though I returned overseas to confront from overseas to confront the charges, even though I've never missed any of hundreds of court appearances in this case before Judge Kaplan. If this argument were to be believed, I would have to cross 8 borders overland with no passport to get to Ecuador, in the middle of a pandemic, no less. The risk of flight argument is based on false pretenses, and I think it's profoundly unfair. One final point. The affected communities in Ecuador won the underlying environmental case after an 8-year trial in Chevron's preferred jurisdiction of Ecuador. That victory still stands. It poses risk to Chevron. It was affirmed on appeal 3 times in Ecuador. It was affirmed in Canada unanimously by the country's Supreme Court for purposes of enforcement. The highest courts in Ecuador and Canada have validated the case for enforcement purposes, as has the highest appellate court in New York, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. The Ecuadorian communities have a robust and capable international legal team, apart from me, that is exploring all options to enforce the judgment. The case is continuing, and Chevron will, I believe, be forced to comply with its legal obligations to the people of Ecuador. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Next up, we have Alec Baldwin.
Am I unmuted? Okay. Thank you all for allowing me to join this this conference. I just wanted to say briefly that I first became familiar with Donziger and his case. I would, as I recall, some article in the Times or something, and then went on to invite him to come and do my podcast, which is an interview show I have on WNYC radio. I began to immerse myself in Berlinger's film and Crude and understanding the details of what took place in Ecuador. And now we arrive where we are now with these just draconian measures that have been taken against Donziger to punish him for his success. I think there are many, many things that we could say today, nearly all of which are relevant and important and illuminating about what's happening with him and what's happening with the case and with Kaplan. But I do want to draw people's attention to this idea that, you know, right now in this country in recent months, we saw a case where an enormously powerful man who was able to intimidate and bully and litigate and get NDAs again with people, he was able to evade justice for years and years and years, and just recently was brought to justice in a criminal case and is in prison now. And I think there are some similarities here. Texaco/Chevron, they are the Harvey Weinstein of the environmental pollution issue. And like Weinstein, they've exploited every opportunity they can to evade justice, to evade punishment. And when Donziger takes us through when he takes us through the history of the case, where, if I'm not mistaken, Chevron themselves insisted the case be tried in Ecuador. They did not want the case tried in the United States. They didn't think they could get a fair trial. They thought they had the whole country down there bought and sold and everything nice and tidy, and they insisted the case be down there. And Donziger won, and he won again, and he won again, which drove them insane. So they had to come back to the United States, to New York, where they could get a judge that was really going to play ball. The issue in cases like this very often, not always, but very often, are justices like Kaplan. Kaplan is bought and sold. He is bought and sold by the oil industry. What he's done to Donziger is not only unfair, as you've been told, it's unprecedented. It's unprecedented the way he's treated him and punished him for winning. He took the case to other jurisdictions, as he mentioned, including Canada, where he won again. It was reaffirmed again and again and again. The Chevron has achieved their goal. And again, I want to stress that Chevron's behaving like all oil companies. They want to discover oil. They want to pump oil and refine oil. And the damage is just considered collateral damage because they believe the world is addicted to this material. So Chevron/Texaco is behaving like all other oil companies, whether it's BP in destroying the Gulf of Mexico or the Exxon Valdez. They're like, well, you know, this shit happens. Attorneys from Gibson Dunn, some of whom are acquaintances of mine in the not-for-profit world, they're behaving like law firms. The difference is Kaplan. The difference is Kaplan. Justice resides in the hands of a judge. And Kaplan is bought and sold by Chevron. He is bought and sold by them. And that's why he's visited all these horrible things on Donziger and punished Donziger and tried to wear him down with this case. The last thing I'll say is there's only one issue that needs to be discussed here, and that is, what is the right thing to do on behalf of the Ecuadorian people? All of that gets obfuscated. All of that gets distorted. All of that gets set aside and sidestepped by Gibson Dunn, by Chevron, by Kaplan. That's the last thing you ever hear about. No one ever even brings it up. What needs to be done to make things right by the Ecuadorian people? Where you have this area, as they've mentioned, which is the most fouled environmental spillage in the history of the oil industry. And you never hear that discussed, never. And I would like to make sure we start to bring that conversation back to the fore, that we bring that back to the center of this whole debate, which is what is going to be done to remediate the problem down in Ecuador? You know, this is all a distraction. What's happening to Stephen, which is horrible and needs to be stopped, that's a horrible thing. But we need to get this over with. We need to get Donziger freed. We need to have all of this insanity that's been brought to bear by this corrupt judge. He is a corrupt human being. We need to get all this set aside to get back to and get away from the distractions of what's happening to Stephen. You know, right now Donziger is the victim. We need to get back to the real victims. The real victims here are the people of Ecuador. The real victims are the environment, that part of the rainforest that was ruined forever. It could take millions of years to remediate the damage done down there. Millions. We'll all be long gone by then. But I think we need to get that conversation. We need to get this over with. We need to get Donziger freed. We need to give Kaplan a real neck adjustment here so he sees things clearly, or someone has to. And then we have to get back to the issue, which is what can be done to help the people of Ecuador, who their entire system, their entire ecosystem was destroyed by Texaco and by Chevron. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alec. And next we're going to hear from legendary musician and activist Roger Waters. Roger?
Okay, Alec, well said. By the way, there's one thing that I would take up with you. You kept saying that Kaplan had been bought and sold. He hasn't been sold to anybody. He's just been bought. And he has. And I'd like to go back I'll say very little, but I'd like to go back to what Paul was saying earlier. And to be here, you know, I know that we're all the choir and we're all singing to one another and we're in a tiny bit of, you know, in a few pews off the side of the nave. But nevertheless, this is a very important meeting in my view, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you people. Paul said that this story has not caught the attention of the media, and I scribbled that down because I went, wow, what a surprise that is. You know, because no, of course it hasn't. Why? Because the media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, blah, 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 MSNBC, everybody is in exactly the same boat as Judge Kaplan. They too are bought, and they're bought by big oil, they're bought by the industry, and they are absolutely controlled. So what is great about what Jody has brought to the table with the other laureates, because there is so much weight behind the august and laudable nature of their association and the fact that they are all Nobel laureates, is she presents us with a stick that we can sharpen with our resolve. And we can stick into these, I won't use the F word, even in the plural, because and that is what this meeting is about, and that is what is happening. That's what is happening in this webinar. And it makes me so happy. I've only been involved in this for, I don't know, 6, 7 or 8 years, but I did go to Ecuador, further to Alec's point about the clients in this case. So, you know, the beautiful photograph that we see of Stephen when he was a boy all those years ago with those lovely people when he started to represent them. I have stood in his shoes with those people and looked into their eyes when I visited Ecuador a couple of years ago. So I feel an enormous emotional attachment to this whole thing. And I could go on and on and on and on and on, and I'm not going to, I'm going to stop. But I think we've got this guy by the balls now, and all we have to do is squeeze as hard as we can, because this cannot be swept under the rug interminably, under the rug, which is what they're constantly trying to do. They lift the corner of the rug and they try and sweep underneath it. Well, that rug is getting lumpy, and it's getting lumpy because of all you people here and all the other hundreds of thousands of activists all over the world who support this cause and who want Stephen freed of his ankle bracelet and blah, blah, blah. And I will finish now, but it's so good to see you all here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Roger. So hard to follow that, but following that is Paul Paz-Emino, the Associate Director of Amazon Watch, who's been working on this case for the last 13 years.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try my best to follow Alec Baldwin and Roger Waters. You guys are fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. So many incredibly important things that you said. And first and foremost, from my point of view, the fact that you're willing to support this and help us get the attention it needs is critical, because that is what's happening at this stage. Amazon Watch has been working on this case for almost 20 years. And my time with Amazon Watch has been the last 13. So I've been there in Ecuador. Obviously, we've been connected and are working hand in hand with the people who've been affected. We've worked in support of the legal efforts in Ecuador and here. I've been in the courtroom for all of what Kaplan inflicted upon the idea of justice in New York. I've seen every single stage of the intimidation tactics, the lies, the bribery, the scams, and the unethical and illegal behavior by Chevron and their lawyers. It is a very palpable and incredible threat to the idea of justice and corporate accountability in the United States on the level that it's shocking to me that the news does not cover. Please keep in mind, we are here because Texaco deliberately, willfully, and as a cost-saving measure, and admittedly dumped 16 billion gallons of toxic waste into the Ecuadorian Amazon, the first company to ever drill for oil in the Amazon, setting the precedent that others have followed. And they admitted to that crime. And then they began to cover it up. And when they got caught, they knew there was no way to defend themselves based on the evidence. So they spared no expense to make sure that no one would look at the actual crime. And when they knew they were about to lose the case in Ecuador, after decades of the Ecuadorian people, with Stephen's help, fighting to finally achieve justice, they preemptively sued in the United States in a courtroom where they knew they could avoid any mention of the actual contamination. Judge Kaplan struck from the record the actual crime at hand and allowed Chevron to control his courtroom to drum up a narrative. And that's the only thing that the reporters now cover. Judge Kaplan said there was fraud in the case. Never mind the fact that Chevron's witness was bribed $2 million, admitted that he lied, provided no evidence, and there was evidence refuting every one of his claims about the charges that Kaplan's court ruled. Every one of those things has been refuted. It was not considered by the appeal court. It was not considered by the Supreme Court. And so what Kaplan says, Chevron thinks is now fact. And they want to convince the American public that that is the truth. So much so that their CEO stood face to face with me last May and said that there is no evidence of there's no scientific evidence of contamination based on what Kaplan has said. Now, they're going to twist and turn this in every way possible because they want it to be about a fight between Stephen Donziger and Kaplan or lawyers here and avoid the reality of the fact that people are still suffering in Ecuador from this contamination. But it goes much broader than that, because the tactics that Chevron has employed, other oil companies are looking at too. And the climate justice movement is at risk. Corporate accountability is at risk. Slap attacks against organizations like ours, like Greenpeace, like Stand.Earth, are coming left and right. And we have formed a coalition to defend ourselves from it, because this new tactic of manipulating the US judicial system and overwhelming people with armies of lawyers is beating back efforts to fight for climate justice and to stop the fossil fuel industry from its destructive ways. So I cannot overemphasize the importance that we draw attention to the extreme amount of unethical and illegal behavior here by Kaplan, by Gibson Dunn, Chevron's lawyers, and by Chevron themselves. If they're allowed to get away as blatantly as they have done, it puts at risk all of the work that we do on behalf of the environment and climate justice. That's why Amazon Watch is so steadfast in supporting this case. And we need everyone to continue to push this story very hard until we break through that crack of the mainstream media and people understand what's happening. If this were another country, if another human rights lawyer were imprisoned in their home for months without a trial in another country, there would be articles in the New York Times talking about how there's human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, or pick your other country. But when it's happening in New York, they won't pay attention. And so that's why Alec, Roger, everyone who's helped in this case, it's so critical that we keep that up. And I really applaud you and thank you for being a part of this.
Thanks so much, Paul. Well said. We also have with us on the line Ginger Cassidy of the Rainforest Action Network.
Yeah, great to be here, and thanks, Paul. Yeah, many environmental and human rights organizations like Rainforest Action Network who have worked on this issue will continue to challenge what is happening with Stephen and take action to not only protect his rights, but ensure that these attacks are not repeated against others. As we've heard, the case against Chevron is one of the largest environmental and human rights crimes in history and one of the most important corporate accountability cases of our time. It's yet another example of the fossil fuel industry polluting the environment and then using its wealth and legal might to escape justice rather than pay for the cleanup and end the very real human suffering still occurring to this day as a result of its pollution. As we heard, Chevron wants to scare anyone away from helping the Ecuadorians and clearly is willing to break the law to do that. I think it's really beyond outrageous that Chevron, already found guilty in order to pay billions of dollars, has yet to be held accountable for the crimes in the Amazon, while Stephen, a longtime environmental and human rights advocate, has been imprisoned in his home. This continued arbitrary detention sets a very dangerous precedent that violates the core concepts of justice and freedom in the United States judicial system. Even amidst this global crisis we are facing, this story should be front page news and should be denounced by anyone who cares about democracy and basic American freedoms. All we want in the end is that we want justice for the communities in Ecuador and Amazon who continue to deal with the devastating impacts of oil pollution. Access to clean water is a basic human right that everyone should have. And we will all continue to not be silenced and will continue to fight for Stephen and the communities in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ginger. So again, my name is Ariel Boone. I'm here with Amazon Watch, and I'm moderating the questions that will follow our final speaker, who we haven't gotten to yet. If you want to put questions in the private chat in Zoom to me, you can chat them to me. Again, my name's Ariel Boone. If you're on the phone and you don't have the web interface for Zoom, we'll open up for phone questions after we do the web interface questions. And we've gotten a couple questions already, so thank you to the journalists who have submitted questions. So next up, we have Simon Taylor from Global Witness.
Hello, everybody. How to follow all my processes. I think I'll keep it short, just to clarify a little bit of the work that we've been doing and our position on this issue. So I've spent much of the last 20 years or so investigating oil, gas and mining sectors around the world, looking in many countries at the behavior of these different actors, which have been involved in corruption, various malfeasant activities that have driven conflict and have been engaged in the looting of states. This has given us quite a lot of experience in the sector. Some of this work has been directed towards shining a big spotlight because the light on otherwise opaque activities can have quite an interesting astringent effect. But transparency itself is not enough to deal with the scale of the problem. There was a recent study done by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which looked at 4 different major industrial sectors, one of which was the extractive sector. And basically they were looking at different criminal cases, corruption cases that involved senior level management. And many of those cases involved oil, gas and mining companies. Their finding was that the extractive sector of the 4 sectors they looked at was the most corrupt. And I just like to sort of explain what I mean by corruption. Corruption, many people think of as sort of movement of cash in brown envelopes, and it's delineated in the legal world by that which is an abuse of one particular statute or another. But corruption itself is a much wider thing than just the use. It involves manipulation, it involves coercion, and so on. So I would agree with the OECD finding. I think the sector is inherently a corrupt sector. Some of the other work we've done has been really focusing a light on holding the rich and powerful companies and individuals to account. Sometimes that involves provision of evidence, and hopefully that through cooperation with law enforcement, the filing of complaints and so on, can lead to the useful outcomes where judicial authorities pursue corrupt cases or others and hold the powerful to account. And in doing that, we've very often come into contact with the Southern District of New York. And I just say, speaking for myself, I've often found the Southern District to be a sort of world leader in holding the corrupt in many of the jurisdictions we've been looking into account. So I've always put them kind of on a pedestal. But the reason I'm referencing all of this stuff is that this case that involves Stephen and the wider sort of factors around the situation of lack of accountability and justice for the Ecuadorians comes back to the Southern District and sheds, I think, some shame on the Southern District. It's taken the Southern District somewhat off the pedestal I had put it on, and I find that personally quite shocking. There is something altogether, I don't really know how to frame it. There's something unjust, there's something wrong at the core of the prosecution effort now underway. And in my view, based on the evidence that I've seen that's in the public domain, this needs to be investigated. What's going on now needs to stop. There is something not quite right about it. And I think we need to see an end to this, and as others have pointed out, so that we can go back to the real subject, which is, what about the plight of the people affected by the pollution in the forest, which has been so successfully avoided as a subject of discussion? So I'll stop with that, and I'd like to just add my thanks and celebrate support of the Nobel Laureates who are joining us today. And I think it's fantastic to have them joining this effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. So Simon was the final speaker that we had queued up for this morning, and now we're going to take your questions. So I see that Greg Palast has a question in the chat. Greg, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, if you can hear me now?
Yes, all good.
Okay, a couple things. I have one question for Mr. Donziger and one for Mr. Baldwin. Greg Palast, Guardian USA. I'm going to tell you straight up, I may have some problems reporting this, as other reporters do, because Chevron filed a complaint with me with BBC Television when I did my investigation in Ecuador. And I went through a year of hearings and almost got fired. So not many journalists want to go through that. But here I am again. So Mr. Donziger, how much support have you gotten from the Cofan Nation, from the indigenous people of Ecuador in your struggle? That's all. It's a difficult question, but where are they? Can you hear me?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So through the years, the case has gotten a huge amount of support from the indigenous nations of Ecuador, both in the affected area more broadly. There's approximately 35 indigenous nations in Ecuador, and they're all organized, and the National Federation is extremely supportive of the lawsuit. The plaintiffs in the case are a combination of indigenous peoples and local communities who migrated to that part of Ecuador over the last several decades, many to get jobs in the oil industry, and they formed a united plaintiff class to push the lawsuit forward. Of course, there's at times disputes, and some groups support certain factions and other groups support other factions, but generally we've had a huge amount of support from the indigenous communities of Ecuador. And I will say the case raises critically important issues of indigenous rights that affect all 400 million approximately indigenous peoples in this world. these are people who fought years and years to win a case. They played by the rules. They went into court in Ecuador where Chevron wanted the case held, and they won. And now Chevron says they can't collect primarily because of the technical reason that Chevron keeps its money in wholly owned subsidiaries. And the judgments against Chevron and the wholly owned subsidiaries are called, for example, Chevron Canada in Canada. And for that technical reason, after 25 years of litigation battles, Chevron is now claiming that even if we're right, and we believe we are, they can't collect the first dollar for this legal technical reason. So can you imagine indigenous peoples all over the world taking the effort to hire lawyers and go to court and fight their environmental justice and other battles to vindicate their rights? And at the end of a long struggle, they can't collect for a reason related to a corporate bail issue having to do with a subsidiary. It's really a terrifying concept for indigenous rights in Ecuador and all over the world, and indeed for the rights of all communities who feel the effects of these terrible pollution problems that exist really all over the place.
Can I jump in on that before
Go for it, Paul.
Next question? I want to add, obviously Amazon Watch's mission is to work with and support the rights of indigenous peoples. This case in every single aspect is a massive violation of the right to access to justice. When you think about what's happened since the very beginning, when the communities were told oil was good for their skin, that they could bathe in it, that they could walk on it on the streets where Texaco was spraying on the roads, to when they went to New York to first sue Texaco and spend 10 years fighting for the right to bring their case there, was denied. They were told, go back to your country, sue there. They did. Chevron did everything they could to undermine and stop that case from happening. When they saw that it was going to lose, they went back to New York and sued them without allowing them to bring the evidence of the crime. Then, at the same time, they turned to other international bodies. They went to a bilateral trade agreement and with an arbitration panel, circumvented the participation of any individual harmed in the first place and argued that the government of Ecuador should cover Chevron's debts, and they were responsible. And when they tried to enforce it in Canada, they prevented that as well by saying that those indigenous communities couldn't sue Chevron Corporation in Canada and that the Canadian subsidiary was not responsible. So at every single turn, indigenous communities have been told, you don't get justice here. And when they go face to face with Chevron's management, the answer is this dismissive, racist response is, we're sorry that you're so simple that you have been taken advantage of by greedy New York lawyers. These are communities that have fought for decades amidst poison and destruction and other human rights violations. So the very idea of indigenous peoples taking an oil company to court and actually winning, which they did, is something Chevron cannot allow to stand. Because that's what, when Stephen was talking about the other indigenous communities around the world affected, could stand up and use that as their tool to get justice as well. And that's a fundamental principle of this as well, which unfortunately gets lost in so many of the other details.
Thanks, Paul. We have several more questions from press, so I'm going to go as fast as I can, and I encourage speakers to try and limit your responses to 90 seconds. Yeah.
I think Greg had a question for Alec. But real quick, you had a question for Alec.
Yeah, that's right. I jumped in. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Greg, what's your question?
You need to unmute him.
Oh, wait.
Hold on, Greg.
Okay.
Maybe we can oh, you got it? Okay.
Okay, so I have a very simple question. You've worked a lot with Democrats, Mr. President, and where are the Democratic Party leaders in protecting Mr. Donziger have you talked to them? Have you gotten any response on protecting Stephen Donziger or the indigenous people of Ecuador against the oil companies?
You're still muted, Alec.
Who's Alec?
But one that, of course, and this is my opinion, is colored by what we're going through now with the health crisis. that seems to have set aside all other concerns. I mean, a lot of people here, you see residents of Wisconsin and Ohio and other cities. A woman was on the news the other day. I don't want to say that this is emblematic of anything, but the woman was bending down and showing you the undyed roots of her hair, and how she wants the freedom to go have her hair done now. So the concerns, the life and death concerns, in typical American fashion, the life and death concerns of the Ecuadorian people affected by what Chevron and Texaco did have been set aside by people's need to have their hair dyed here in the United States. But I think that you open up a huge can of worms there. I think that things can't get any worse than they are now in terms of what kind of action this government might take. This is a pro-business, it's a pro-wealth, it's a pro-real estate, it's a pro-oil administration. And hopefully, if there's a change in the White House and in the Senate for that matter, things will brighten in terms of what action might be taken, not just on behalf of Donziger, because we don't need anybody to, we don't need a change in the White House to affect what's happening to Donziger. We just need to have a public relations campaign to shame Kaplan. I believe that could be ultimately a very effective thing, to shame Kaplan and to shed a light, because as what was the gentleman's name who was speaking last? Mr. Taylor, Simon Taylor, is that his name?
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, as Mr. Taylor so articulately, put it out there. A lot of people don't even know what's going on with this. They have no idea. Donziger's story and the story of what's going on in courtrooms in New York and what Kaplan is riding roughshod over, no one even knows about that right now. And if we expose that and shed some light on that in some serious way, coronavirus be damned. We can't let the coronavirus suspend due process in this country, even though there are people who certainly would like to try to do that. But I think that it's a difficult time to talk about anything other than ventilators and masks and gloves and when are we going to open up the economy, and a 50-year high in job creation has been erased. We are I was listening to NPR this morning. We are at Depression era levels of unemployment in this country. And no one wants to use that word. They want to keep saying recession, recession, recession. We are at Depression era levels of unemployment in this country. And that's what all the focus goes to. But I think that the people on this phone call know that we shouldn't let everything else just get set aside. We shouldn't let justice get set aside for Donziger or the Ecuadorian people. I think we need a campaign like this, what we're doing now, times 1,000 online and so forth, to shed light on what exactly Kaplan has done, because what Kaplan has done to Donziger is criminal as far as I'm concerned.
I see that Jody has her hand raised. Jody, do you want to speak briefly on this?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. I've been an activist since the Vietnam War. And, as I listen to this, and I admittedly am new to this action for Stephen and the people of Ecuador, although I've heard of the case, certainly. Am I on?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. I think that the actions taken by everybody going to court and speaking on Stephen's behalf, et cetera, are terrific. But I really believe we need some public action by important people that the press would have to cover, or would find it more difficult to avoid covering. I certainly have organized and led protests off and on many issues. I think we need to think about what we can do publicly at the same time that Kaplan is being attacked judicially. But I think it's really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Jody. We have a question from Andrew Strickler at Law 360, which is, can Stephen or anyone else who was there, I know that others on this call were there, give an update on the state of the bar action against him in New York and talk about what happened at the bar hearing?
Sure. Andrew, I'll be brief and we can send you the documents offline. But in a nutshell, and everybody should know that as part of the attack on me by Chevron, I had my law license suspended without a hearing in the summer of 2018 when the Bar Grievance Committee determined that I was an immediate threat to the public interest. That is, a human rights lawyer who won a case was an immediate threat to the public interest. And I'd love to have Roger comment on that if he can, because we've talked about that, and I think he might have some interesting things to say. In a nutshell, while I was on home detention last September with an ankle bracelet on my ankle, I got special permission from the court to attend my own bar hearing, at which 13 witnesses came over a period of 4 days to testify, including Roger Waters and many other lawyers. Simon Taylor was there also testifying on my behalf. And there were 8 Chevron lawyers in the back and watching and monitoring. Bottom line is the hearing officer ruled in my favor, recommended my law license be restored, praised my integrity. It's only a recommendation, though. It has to go to a court for approval, but 99% of these recommendations generally are approved. So I'm hopeful I'll get my law license back so I can continue practicing my profession to the fullest extent that I'm able. So I think that's a very significant event because the hearing officer is the only judicial officer in the United States who has ever reviewed Judge Kaplan's findings, his factual findings. The Second Circuit never reviewed those findings. And the only person who reviewed them and listened to my side of the story ruled in my favor. And I think that's extremely significant for history. And it's extremely significant for me personally. I want to be a lawyer. I want to do my job for my clients, not just in Ecuador, but in other places around the world. And I don't know if Roger would like to weigh in on that, but I see that as a very significant thing.
Yeah, I was there. I appeared in front of the referee for the Bar Association as a character witness for Stephen, as did many other people. You know, Rex Weiler was there, and many other people were there, and we were there with a simple message for the referee, which is, this is a crock of shit. What is all this about? And the referee, to his eternal credit, and I've forgotten the gentleman's name now, but he's in my heart forever, and I will respect him forever. He crafted an opinion in the form of his recommendation to the Bar Association that was brilliant, without ever breaking any of the rules of protocol or judicial procedure. He told Lewis Kaplan exactly who he was and what he was. And he found for Stephen and said, not only do I recommend you give him his license back now, but that he keeps it forever because he's doing proper work and so on. So, you know, that's kind of all I have to say about that. The stuff about, other stuff that I've been listening to, about the press, which is super important. You know, I agree with Jody, obviously. In fact, all of you on this. What is the government and press for? Who are they supposed to work for? They're supposed to work for us. We the people. They're the servants of we the people. This, of course, in the United States of America and many, many other places in the world is not the case. The people are the servants of the government and the press and the oligarchies who rule everything in this country. So the greatest stumbling block, if you like, or impediment to everything that Paul and Simon Taylor and everybody else is doing, really, in this country at least, is American exceptionalism. We have to get that elephant out of the room so that we can look at the fundamental issues of how societies might be organized in a better world. I'm going to read you something very short, and that I wrote an opera about the French Revolution a number of years ago, and there's one little stanza in it that I wrote in the libretto, and it goes like this: tears like falling rain slake the thirst and douse the flames, but cooling in the crucible an idea forms a nugget of belief in the hearts of the poor, that maybe in the dawn's new light they have a right to the law. And I only spout those lyrics now, 20, 30, 40 years after I wrote them, because this is what we're waiting for. We're waiting for Mistress Liberty to take off the blindfold, you know, for the scales of justice to become evenly balanced between the rich and the poor, between the haves and the have-nots, and so on and so forth. I'll stop blathering on.
Thank you so much, Roger. I heard, Alec, that you might want to pop in here.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I just want to say, that one issue that this reminds me of is I worked for years regarding campaign finance reform. We're back in the day when the Buckley-Vallejo decision was approved, was passed in 1976. The basic understanding by people who are proponents of campaign finance reform was that the court ruled that cash is speech, and opponents of that, not opponents, but critics of that decision said that the problem is that if cash is speech, then the person with the most cash speaks the loudest. And that's what seems to be happening in courts in this country as well. Chevron is loaded up and they've got every kind of missile, every kind of bomb, every kind of armament you need to do battle in court. And Chevron is allowed to have a due process beyond what Donziger is entitled to. Chevron is entitled to have a due process and a representation in court beyond what the people in Ecuador are entitled to. What the press needs to understand is that Donziger, you can take criticisms of him, and they tried to dirty him up and smear him in many, many ways to nullify. Again, that word nullify, we're always trying to nullify people who win. We're trying to take away their win when it doesn't serve our interests. And Donziger won. Chevron insisted that the case be heard in Ecuador, and Donziger went down to Ecuador and he beat them. And it wasn't, as Jody mentioned, I think she made a misstatement when she said 9.5 million. It was 9.5 billion with a B. Donziger won $9.5 billion on behalf of the Ecuadorian people. And that's when all of a sudden Chevron turns around and goes, no, we can't have that. We can't have that. Our mistake, flag on the play. We want to take a mulligan here, and we want to move the case back to New York where we might be able to have more influence. And Donziger kept on winning. But Chevron is entitled to a level of justice they have bought for themselves. They have purchased for themselves a level of justice that is beyond what the Ecuadorian people were entitled to and beyond what Donziger himself was entitled to. The only way that Chevron can win this case is to handicap Donziger, is to have some kind of, on the game, on the ice. We've got to be high sticking here. We've got to be knocking people out of the game and hurting them, because otherwise they can't win. On a level playing field, Donziger kicked their ass. He kicked Chevron's ass. And they were like, hey man, we can't let that stand. This little punk lawyer in his office in New York, he's giving you $9.5 billion. We can't have any Aaron Brockovich bullshit here. He's got to go. We got to get him somehow. So they targeted him, and they've abused him, and they've done everything they can to nullify the fact that he won. Donziger won. The people of, and Donziger didn't just win, the people of Ecuador won. And I think that if this case gets reinstated, and I just want to try to lighten this up a moment, I want Stephen Donziger to pledge that if he realizes all the legal fees that might be coming to him as well, let's face facts, he's entitled to fees for this, that he contemplates funding a production of Roger Waters' musical about the French Revolution. I'd like some of that money to go into the production of the French Revolution musical. Thank you. Sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, Alec. We have a question from Darna Noor of Gizmodo, which is, how has this case impacted ongoing legal battles for climate justice and human rights in the Amazon? Has it inspired more people to take on these cases? Has it discouraged people who want to avoid facing a similar fate to Mr. Donziger's?
You want me to try to answer that real quick? Paul and Ginger and Simon might, can people hear me? Is this okay if I talk?
Yeah.
Okay. Paul and Ginger and Simon also, I think, can answer this quickly as well.
Yeah.
Look, I think one of the objectives of Chevron is to deter lawyers from taking on these cases. And they want to hold up my scalp and say, look what happened to Donziger. This could happen to you. And, when I talk about the case to people around law schools and wherever, I try, that can be kind of a demoralizing message. People like look at me and like, oh my God, here's like this guy who's been doing this all these years and look where he ended up. Well, this is not the end of the game for me or for the case. I truly am optimistic, and I believe that the win that the Ecuadorians obtain in Ecuador, with my help and the help of other lawyers as well, will be realized in the not too distant future. As Alec pointed out, the reason this is happening to me is because we won, not because we did anything wrong. And I think it's very important to remember that. Chevron would like people to believe that this is all for naught. I hope young lawyers do these cases and take on these responsibilities. But I think it's not just up to lawyers, it's up to all of us in society to create the kind of society where there's enough space and enough fairness and enough even-handedness, where these types of cases, once begun, can not only have success, but where the lawyers who do them and the community leaders who really are behind them, people like Luis Llanza and Emergildo Criollo and all the people we work with over the years, some of them very good friends of mine, where they get recognized and celebrated as the heroes of our society, of the environment, and of efforts to reverse climate change and save the planet. Because that's at core is what this is about. So I can't speak for what's going on in the world. All I can say is I'm personally strong, resilient, optimistic. I'm hurt. This is very hurtful. It's really, I don't like being restricted, having my liberty restricted. It hurts my family and people who care about me and my son. But we are fighting through this, and because of the support of all of you and many, many others, I can't explain what that does to lift our spirits. So I hope people understand that if they take on these cases, there's a hell of a lot of solidarity out there. A lot of it is on this call. There's people like Roger and Alec and Jody and all the other laureates and Paul Pass and so many of you, Simon, Lynn and Bill Twist, who fight for justice every day. And we need to stick together and protect each other, just like we're doing on this call, just like I felt now, really for the entire period of my detention. And I know we can get through this. And I think if that message is sent to young lawyers, people will understand that while there are risks when you do this work, we all can create a world where this work can flourish, and those who do it can be recognized appropriately. And also, we really have no choice, because without this work, I don't think this planet is going to survive.
I'll just add quickly on top of that, when it comes specifically to cases, one important note is to remember that Occidental Petroleum performed similarly in the Peruvian Amazon and was sued. Amazon Watch worked with Earth Rights International and Achuar communities affected there, ultimately reaching a settlement with Oxy. That happened before a lot of the current issues in this case. And I'm not sure what would have happened had this case been at this stage when Oxy settled with the Achuar people. But I know that what was happening with the Chevron case at the time emboldened and empowered that case to move forward and achieve justice. But when it comes to personal connections with indigenous communities that we work with and how they look at the United States, I can tell you no one is expecting justice from our system in the United States to defend their rights in the Ecuadorian Amazon or in any other part of the Amazon. It's a joke at this stage when you look at a generational fight, because many people have already suffered and died, and their descendants are having to continue this fight, which is ultimately Chevron's strategy, that the people that they poisoned will simply die and go away, and that's when the fight will end. So that part of it is very disheartening. On the flip side of that, the fact that we're still organized as a community, that the climate justice movement still talks about this case, and that we are still fighting it, gives hope to campaigns that are happening to directly target other oil companies. That's why the process has successfully kicked out oil company after oil company to other parts of the Ecuadorian and Peruvian and other parts of the Amazon. So it's important for so many reasons, not the least of which to give hope to continued battles, because this is not ending with this case. And that includes the Ecuadorian government's own oil company Petroecuador and the acts that they've taken in the Amazon after Texaco left. And Roger, I saw you raising your hand. Do you want to unmute? I think you can unmute yourself.
I mean, what I was saying, what I wanted to say was that we've seen the encouragement that you're talking about, Paul. You and I stood in front of that courthouse in Toronto, and at the Appellate Court, right there in Canada, went part of the process of taking the court there, and I met, Fontaine. What's his name? Come on. It doesn't matter. Anyway, one of the First Nation people. So now we're seeing the Wet'suwet'en. Is that how you pronounce the name of the tribes in the West, in the Native Americans in the west of Canada, who are organizing protests all over Canada now because of the illegal taking of a pipeline through their land. We've seen, although Standing Rock was in 2016, the winter of 2016 of 2015 going into 2016, and it only came to an end when Trump was elected and signed an executive order to send the army in to kill anyone who got in their way, which they did. But the echoes of Standing Rock will never fade away, and that movement is growing every single day. That the Standing Rock movement is growing. I have something to do with it, so I know a tiny bit about it. So what Stephen has done for the last 25 years for the people of Ecuador, other people are doing for indigenous peoples in other parts of the land. Not least supporting the Mapuche in Argentina and Chile, and also more awareness of the predicament of the Aboriginal people in Australia, and so on and so forth. There is generally now a focus coming upon, whoa, what was that thing that we did 400 years ago? We, the white settler colonialists who spread ourselves all over the world and fucked everything up, we're just beginning to look at it all now. Okay, so this is hugely important. This case is so fundamentally important. I've written this often before, but this case against Chevron, we have to win this case for the people of Ecuador, those people, for them, but not just for them. This has to spread. The idea that the law is about the law and not about finance. It's a bit like Alec was talking about, that democracy should be about one man, one vote, not about whoever's richest gets to rule everything. And he's right, obviously, but so that's why this little webinar is so incredibly important. So I'll stop now.
Thank you, Roger. And I know, Jody, you also want to speak. I want to make sure that we get a question out on the floor before that. Journalist Adam Klasfeld has a question. Adam, I'm unmuting, or yeah, go for it.
Thank you for holding this. Just a kind of, this today is happening obviously in the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I noticed, Stephen, that you have been, while dealing with all of this, talking about how the pandemic has affected the people of Ecuador. So I was wondering if you can tie these two together. How have you been contacting the people of Ecuador as they can contend with this global pandemic and the communities in the rainforest?
Thank you, Adam, for the question. Just so people know, Adam Klasfeld works for Courthouse News, and he's been covering this situation since the RICO case almost 10 years ago. So thank you, Adam, for being on the call. I have gotten extremely involved with friends of mine in Ecuador who are dealing with the impact of COVID. It's so bizarre. I'm living in the United States, in Manhattan at the moment, which is the epicenter of the epidemic in the United States. And I have friends in Guayaquil, Ecuador, which is the epicenter of the epidemic in Latin America. And you can see my Twitter feed. I won't get into too much detail here other than to say that there's a major, major humanitarian crisis, obviously in many places around the world. I feel for Ecuador in particular, in the sense that Guayaquil is probably the highest death rate of COVID in the world. Again, the media is not really covering it. It's on the backs of an inexplicable payment by the country's president of $325 million to Wall Street bondholders on March 24th, when no one from the so-called developing world was paying creditors so they could save money to deal with the pandemic. So, you know, look, part of that is I've been to Ecuador over 250 times in my life from New York. I live in New York. I have, you know, people there I really care about, including many of our clients. And it concerns me greatly. So, you know, I'm happy to call attention to this to the extent possible, but obviously we're also suffering here in New York and in the United States. Our healthcare workers on the front lines are taking completely unnecessary risks given the lack of preparation by our national government. That concerns me as well. So all of this stuff matters. And of course, isn't it all connected at some level deep down? Of course it is. You know, the failure of our society to be organized in such a way that it can deal with a pandemic is related to its failure to be organized in such a way that indigenous peoples can achieve a modicum of justice when a corporate polluter despoils their lands. It's all connected. And I care about it all, but thank you for the question. I wanted to refer it to Jody also, because I think she had her hand up, and so did Alec. They might have something to say about this. Jody, you want to weigh in?
Jody?
Or do we lose Jody?
I'm here.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I just wanted to echo something Roger had said about other Indigenous and First Nation people who have struggled so hard, and some have won. You know, Nobel Women's Initiative, which I chair, does a lot of work with women defenders of the environment, because unfortunately, in this day and age, women's voices are not often heard to the extent we should be. And gratifying to see when some of the First Nations people in Canada in particular have fought, they have won. And I think this case is important not just for Stephen and his family and for the people of Ecuador. Winning sends a message to environmental defenders around the world that what they do matters, that it gives them belief that some people in the world are listening to them and care. I was involved briefly in a case in Guatemala where 15 indigenous women had been sex slaves during the civil war there, and we went and stood with them in court, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they won against the military of Guatemala. And when that happened, it ricocheted around the world to women defenders and gave them new hope that, you know, when people come together and struggle, you can find justice. And every time justice is found, it makes people more, you know, have more belief, which is why we need justice for Stephen and justice for the people of Ecuador and justice for the people of the US and Canada and my friend who was murdered in Honduras for defending her environment. You know, the ripple effect of this, as you all know, is massive. I'm happy to be able to be a little part of it. Thank you very much.
We had a question from Nick Breeze for Alec Baldwin. So using the Harvey Weinstein analogy that you used before, lots of celebrities campaign for environment and climate action. How do you think that you can encourage more celebrities to start calling for rigorous environmental and ecocide law enforcement?
Are we good now? We're good?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Well, two things. One is that, I mean, most people, I don't want to speak for people like Roger Waters or whatever, who are, you know, just legendary figures in the world of music and entertainment. I don't want to speak for them, but I do know sometimes it becomes dispiriting for me that a cause needs somebody famous in order to get it jump started. A lot of celebrities I know sit there and go, you're kidding. You're telling me that your supporters aren't going to come to your dinner at the Waldorf Astoria and give you $1,000 a ticket unless Jerry Seinfeld shows up and does 10 minutes on stage. It's a little distressing, but I think, but where that is effective sometimes is in the halls of Congress. I have gone to Washington and lobbied, more years ago than I do lately, because I got remarried and I got 4 little kids, so I can barely comb my hair, let alone go to Washington. But the trips I've made to Washington that were organized properly, we had a host organization that helped us to identify the right people. We briefed assiduously. We made sure we had all of our facts and all of our cover set up. They're going to say this, so you're going to say this. They're going to counter with this, and you're going to have this information ready. When we prepped and we briefed and we went down to Washington, we had some startling results. I won't go into the details of that now, but on behalf of campaign finance reform, on behalf of federal support of the arts and different subjects that I've supported over the years. I think the same is true here. We've got to organize going down to Washington. We've got to have a trip to go down to Washington, and we've got to find who the right people are. You don't want to waste your time with anybody but the right people, the men and women that have their finger on the committees that can help change the situation. Because, and I would be more than happy to participate in this, because the thing that I keep coming back to, and I'll finish with this, is that that yes, there were purportedly vast levels of information to support criminal negligence in the underpinnings of Exxon Valdez and Deepwater Horizon. There was a lot of negligence there. There were a lot of things that shouldn't have happened that teed up those events, and horrible things resulted as in the wake of those events. There were things that should have been addressed. There were things that should have been fixed, but this is different. Ecuador, the Donziger case is different. There were no accidents here, none. A drunken sailor did not crash a boat onto the shores of Alaska. A bunch of guys didn't blow up, some drill bit or whatever the hell you want to call it. Some wellhead didn't explode in the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. What Texaco and Chevron did in Ecuador was deliberate. It was deliberate. They deliberately pumped the oil and dumped all of the spillage and all of the waste all over. They carpeted the whole basin of this rainforest with this stuff deliberately. And then when they got caught, when they got busted, so to speak, when Donziger et al. Come into town and put them on trial, they lost. So they did it deliberately. They lost. They appealed. They lost. So what do? They went and bought themselves a judge. The only thing they could do, if this was played on a level playing field, they would have kept on losing, and they would have had to pay maybe not $9.5 billion, but they would have had to pay something significant. We have to keep saying that over and over again, that the distinction about Ecuador and Texaco, Chevron and Ecuador is that there were no accidents here. These people did this willfully and deliberately, and then they walked away. They walked away and they said, hey man, this is the oil game. Bad things happen. We need oil. We have to have oil. You need oil. You know how much shit I get online from people who say to me, why don't you shut up, Alec Baldwin? What are you going to fuel up your private plane with? And I'm like, okay. If you told me that I couldn't fly on any kind of a plane for a while and it would save the environment, I'd learn to live with that. I'd learn to travel by train. I'd learn how to do it. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we ban commercial aviation, but my point is is that there's the nullification you always hear all the time. You ask about celebrities. Maybe celebrities can get the attention of members of Congress, because of course they're going to come to you and ask you to raise money for them one day. You can bet your bottom dollar these people are going to call me 6 months later, or some aide is going to call and go, hey, they're having a fundraiser for so-and-so in New York or Los Angeles. Do you think you can help us out? I mean, it's a game, which is why I've always been heavily motivated by campaign finance reform. But just to finish this, the answer is yes, but it's got to be done right. You got to get the right people. You got to get the people. Roger Waters would be great. People who've had longevity in this issue. People who've been there for years arguing about this issue. We will find the right people. We will brief them. We will go over everything with them, and we will go to Washington and we will fight for this issue as soon as possible. It probably doesn't make any sense right now. I mean, maybe we can go down to the House, and I've got a lot of people who can reach out to Pelosi and get that done. We can do that, but probably we'd rather wait and make that move and see what happens in November. Because if there's a new administration in office, if a new administration comes into the White House, things are going to be infinitely easier for us in that regard.
Thanks so much, Alec. We are approaching the end of our time for this press conference, but I wanted to offer our panelists and speakers, if anybody has a final 60 seconds, something that came up that they wanted to respond to, or any last comment.
Can I just say something super quick, and this will be my last comment? Before I thank it. One is, think about this. Adam Klasfeld asked about the pandemic in Ecuador, and I want to connect this back up to the pandemic. The people of Ecuador won this case in 2011, and part of the decision was to build hospitals to deal with things like cancers, people who have their immune systems compromised, the most vulnerable people to the pandemic. But those hospitals were never built because Chevron never paid the judgment. How many people in Ecuador, which has one of the highest COVID rates in the world, where indigenous peoples are fleeing into the Amazon to avoid this terrible virus, how many people have died because they had their immune systems compromised by Chevron's pollution, and then it's compounded by its failure to actually pay the court judgment so people could get treatment? Think about that. My final comment is I want to, everyone else to speak, obviously, but I just want to thank everybody again. Roger and Alec and Jody, I have such respect for each of you, your integrity, your courage, the work you've done thus far in your lives, what you've added to our world, to humanity. I've personally gotten enjoyment out of all of you, whatever you do. Jody, your incredible work on landmines and other things through the years, having met you 30 years ago. Roger, your music and your activism, and Alec, your acting and your activism. And of course, everyone else who's spoken on this call. Rex Weiler is on this call. He co-founded Greenpeace. Think about that. Think what the world would be like without Greenpeace. Simon, your fabulous work. Paul Pass, Layla. I don't know what to say except that without your involvement both in the world and caring about me and my family, this would be a much more difficult journey. But in a weird way, it's almost easier. As tough as it is, there's something easy about it, knowing that so many incredible people have both my back and the backs of the folks in Ecuador who really are suffering more than you can possibly imagine. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. Jody, thank you. I can't believe you stepped up how you did. Again, to Lynn and Bill Twist, who got this Nobel thing moving a few months ago, and have been by my side every step of the way. So thank you to everybody, and I'll turn it over to the rest of the people. Thanks again, everybody.
1 minute.
I see David Applefield raising your hand, but so Jody, why don't you say something, and then David, we can let you unmute. I don't want to miss your hand.
Hey, Stephen, when you get your passport back, I want to go on a delegation with you to Ecuador, and we should bring journalists who are willing to, take the risk and go. It would be fun. Well, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to hang out in a hideous situation.
I'm seeing Alec raise his thumb, and I'm assuming he's offering to come as well. So we'll all go.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.